These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? The queenside cluster of white's pieces looks knotty, but there is nothing difficult about it if you ask the right questions. We are focusing on attacking ideas with bishops, and for black there is just one: bishop takes knight, forking white's bishop and queen, a small triangle. Of course the white bishop first needs to be traded in for a better target through capture by another black piece, hence 1. Rook takes bishop, 2. Rook takes rook, and now bishop takes knight forks white's rook and queen. Targeting the white queen works because black has protection from its own queen at c4. Are you satisfied with this? You should not be. Remember that when you fork two pieces that aren't the king, one of them can move to protect the other. So think especially carefully about what your opponent's best move will be in reply. Here white can respond to the fork with queen moves to c1, protecting the rook. The sequence still would be profitable since black would have picked up the knight on c3, but keep pushing for ways to go farther. After white's queen moves to c1, rethink the board. White's rook is attacked once and defended once. If black could add his queen to the attack against the rook, then on b2, he would have it. He needs a way to do that without giving white time to move the rook out of danger. He therefore maneuvers the queen into position with a time-consuming, for white, check, queen moves to d4, check. This is safe because we're assuming that white's queen has moved to c1. White has to move his king, and now bishop takes rook wins the rook at no cost because black's queen protects against a recapture. White's better option after the forking move bishop takes knight is to play queen takes at d6, at least taking a pawn rather than making futile efforts to save his rook. Incidentally, at the outset of the position black might be tempted to play bishop takes knight. Once white recaptures on c3 with his bishop, the way is clear for black to take white's loose rook on b1 with rook takes rook, check. But the idea fails because that recapture by white bishop takes bishop c3 is a check. You cannot be too alert to possible checks your opponent can give in the midst of a plan you are devising. A check has the power to stop a tactical sequence in its tracks. White to move. What is the best move? This time start by looking for pairs of black pieces that might be vulnerable to a bishop fork. How? Look for pieces on squares of the same color, or on the same or intersecting diagonals. The c5 knight and e7 bishop are in the right pattern, but there is no way to exchange the bishop for a suitable target. But now what about the pieces on light squares? Black's rooks are on a6 and a8 on the same file, one square apart, and arranged for a bishop fork with bishop takes at b7. White's light squared bishop is aimed the right way, the only trouble is that white's own pawn is in the way at d5. If it is going to move, first the black pawn in front of it has to be moved. You move a pawn by capturing something it protects, here it protects the knight at c5, so 1. Knight takes knight, capture with the least valuable piece you can, leading to 1. Pawn from d6 takes knight, clears black's d-pawn onto the c-file. Now white moves his own pawn forward to d6, making a threat against black's bishop that requires a time-consuming response. After the bishop moves, presumably with bishop takes at d6, white is able to play bishop takes at b7, forking both black rooks and winning the exchange next move. White to move. What is the best move? A position like this is best approached visually. What do you see? Both of black's knights, his a8 rook, and a pawn are lined up on the same light squared diagonal. White's light squared bishop can, in principle, intervene at c6. Nothing can be done with this yet, because pieces are in the way, squares and pieces are guarded, etc. The point is just to see the idea. Then you can play with exchanges, carefully visualizing their consequences to see if they help clear the obstructions out of the way and improve the targets. White has two possible captures that might help the b5 bishop to make trouble, knight takes knight c6 and knight takes knight e4. In effect, those possible captures are options you hold to make the board look different. If you play knight takes knight e4, black will play rook takes knight, and now the board will be changed. Likewise, if you then play knight takes knight c6 and black replies pawn from b7 takes knight. He can't play pawn from d7 takes knight because after white moved his d4 knight, black's d-pawn became pinned to his queen. Black's rook no longer will be protecting the queen, either, having moved to e4 to recapture during the first sequence. Notice how two exchanges white can initiate so change the look of the board even if they don't turn any profits themselves. And then what would be possible? If the position were set in front of you, the answer would be obvious: bishop takes at c6, forking the rooks and winning the exchange. Black plays rook takes bishop e3, and white recaptures rook takes rook. Lesson: move order matters. There are a number of ways to look at white's captures in the wrong order here and find nothing. Capture with the wrong knight first and the sequence is ruined. Black to move. What is the best move? Playing defective bishop forks. We conclude with a series of positions where a potential bishop fork looks unplayable because the forking square is guarded, but where the fork nevertheless is the winning move because checkmate or some other decisive consequence results if the forking piece is taken. We have seen that a parallel logic can make seemingly bad knight forks quite productive. Naturally, the same is true of any other sort of fork that may not look feasible at first. On the left is a first example of the idea. Look for a visual pattern. See that white has his king, rook, and d4 pawn arranged in a classic triangle that calls for consideration of a queen or, here, bishop fork by black. You could also just ask what checks black's bishop has. The only answer is bishop takes at d4. Bishop takes at d4, check. Thus has the potential to take the rook at a1, but the d4 pawn is protected by white's knight. There's no good way to get rid of the knight, but don't stop there. Imagine the sequence failing and ask what it would make possible. It then goes 1. Bishop takes at d4, check. 2. Knight takes bishop. What lines would then be open? What checks would black then have? The answer is queen moves to e1 mate. So the bishop fork at d4 works after all, winning a rook and a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Think visually. White's king and a6 rook are on the same diagonal, inviting bishop moves to c4, check. Or again, you could see this by asking what checks black can give with his bishop and seeing that one of them, bishop moves to c4, also attacks a rook. Either way, the problem is that white protects c4 with his other rook. There is no immediate way to get rid of the rook, but before moving on, ask what happens if black goes through with the fork and white plays rook takes bishop. What checks could black then play? Our pawn from b8 moves to b1, which is checkmate, after white uselessly interposes his rook from c4 to c1. So bishop moves to c4, check. Wins a rook despite the apparent protection of c4 by white's rook, which really can't afford to move. The tip-off here is black's other rook on the second rank. It traps white's king on the first rank, making it vulnerable to a back rank mate if the rook on c1 leaves its post. White to move. What is the best move? Whether you look for black pieces on common diagonals or ask whether white has a way to attack two pieces at once, the same answer appears: bishop moves to d7. The move seems pointless because black just plays queen takes bishop. But ask what checks white then would have. There are 4, queen moves to e8, queen moves to e7, and queen moves to b4, none of which work, and queen takes rook, which is new. Well, the move itself isn't new, but it didn't give check in the initial position, and which leads to checkmate a move later. If black blocks the check with queen moves to e8, white has queen takes queen, checkmate. With protection from the rook on e1. Since black can't afford that, the initial fork bishop moves to d7 actually works well, picking up the knight. The key to seeing this, as ever, is to be thorough in examining checks and their consequences not only on the board in front of you but on the board as it would look after whatever forcing moves you can imagine. You likewise want to be alert to how any recaptures you can force would open lines or leave things loose. Here the black queen's movement off the back rank opens a line to the king from a8, and turns out to be fatal. It is good to see the bishop fork in this position, but there is another route to a similar result that is worth seeing as well. All sorts of possibilities spring up once you realize that black's queen needs to stay on the back rank to prevent white from mating with queen takes rook, for this means the black queen itself is vulnerable to attack. White therefore can play bishop takes at a6, putting black in a pickle. If he plays queen takes bishop, he promptly gets mated, so he moves his queen to d8, where it is safe and continues to protect the rook on a8, but now he has left his knight loose, so white plays queen takes knight. Black's queen was overworked, a theme we have seen before and will study in detail later. There is more than one way to take advantage of such a situation, as this analysis shows. White to move. What is the best move? You can see the idea here visually by noting the dark squared triangle between black's rook, king, and e-pawn, or by asking what checks white can give with his bishop and what else he can attack at the same time. Either way, white would like to play bishop takes at e5 but seemingly is prevented from doing so by the threat of knight takes bishop. But what if that threat is carried out? Lines would be opened by the moves of white's bishop and black's knight. White would have a new check with rook moves to c7, a rook fork which also attacks black's queen. If black moves his king or blocks the check by moving his knight or bishop to d7, white plays rook takes queen. If black plays queen takes rook, then white plays queen takes queen, check. And then, after black moves his king, queen takes rook. Black to move. What is the best move? White's rooks are arranged on the same diagonal and thus could be forked with bishop takes at b2. But that won't do because white is on the verge of mate with queen moves to a8, queen takes at c7, or rook moves to a8. Black's next move therefore needs to be a check that forces white's reply. He has 4. 2 can be dismissed quickly, rook moves to d1 just loses the rook, and queen takes at g2 just loses the queen. A third check, bishop takes at h2, is a little more interesting, as white wouldn't particularly want to reply king takes bishop, for black would then have the queen fork. Queen moves to h6, check, compelling white to trade queens to get out of it. Instead white would move his king to f1. Now black has the queen fork. Queen takes at c1, again forking white's king and queen, but this time without protection. So white plays queen takes queen. Black has taken a pawn and a rook but has given up his queen for the sake of disrupting the mate threat. So all this is possible, and might even seem an appealing reprieve from execution, but hold. For there is yet one more initial check for black to consider. Starting with this last remaining check, queen takes rook, check. Turns out to be most interesting of all. White replies queen takes queen, letting go of his mate threat. Now what would be possible? White's queen and rook would be on the same diagonal, so black toys again with bishop takes at b2. Of course white could just play queen takes bishop. But again you consider what lines would have been opened by all this and what checks black would then be able to inflict. As for open lines, black's bishop would have moved off of the e-file, creating a new path for the rook on e8. Now the rook could move to e1, which would be mate. So in reply to the forking move, white is obliged to move his queen and let his rook on a3 be taken by black's bishop. Black emerges with two rooks and a pawn in exchange for a queen, a slight material gain, and meanwhile he has obliterated white's mating threat and reached a winning position. It's yet another study in the importance of examining every possible check, both on the current board and on the board as it would look after an exchange or two. White to move. What is the best move? Strategic implications. A bishop's power, its potential to execute double attacks, and its usefulness in other ways generally depends on whether it has open lines on which to move. A bishop placed on one of the long diagonals with nothing in its way is a mighty force on the board. A bishop blocked by its own pawns has relatively little use. It might seem to follow from this that you should try to maneuver your bishops onto open diagonals, and indeed that generally is good practice. But there also are other, subtler steps you can take to increase the power of your bishops and limit the power of your opponents. The first thing to understand is that at any given moment your two bishops may differ greatly in their attacking potential. One travels on the dark squares, the other on the light squares. Usually one of them turns out to be more useful than the other, because either the dark or light squares in the middle of the board, but not both, will be open. Open, here, means unoccupied by pawns. Notice that your pawns frequently are set up on squares of the same color, that is how they protect each other. If your pawns are arranged on light squares, those squares are strong for you and the dark squares are weak, i.e., unprotected by pawns. But it also means that your dark squared bishop has room to run and that your light squared bishop is likely to be less useful, at least until the pawn structure changes. Thus we speak of a bishop as good if it travels on squares unobstructed by your own pawns. A bishop is bad if it travels on the same colored squares your pawns do. In the skeletal diagram to the left, both bishops are fianched, i.e., white has developed them to the squares in front of his knight's original positions. The dark squares are very strong for white because he controls them so thoroughly with his pawns. But a side effect is that the bishop on b2, which travels on the dark squares, is bad. the bishop on g2 is good. We focus on the pawns near the center because the best diagonals pass through the middle of the board. If you look back at the studies in this chapter, you will see that the attacking bishop usually takes advantage of open paths through the center. It rarely is the case that there is a center pawn on the same colored square as the bishop that delivers the fork. There may be an enemy pawn there that is captured by the bishop, but there generally is not an allied pawn that blocks the bishop's way. Notice that even one pawn in the middle can be significant, since it single-handedly blocks long diagonals in two different directions. These points have several implications. First and most obviously, you should think of your two bishops as quite different pieces, and you should be much more willing to trade away a bad bishop than a good one. Second, pawns and bishops have an intimate relationship. Think of pawns as pylons that obstruct the paths of the bishops. Every time you move a pawn you open one diagonal and block another, and this may be the most important consequence of such a move. Whether lines are open or closed will matter for your other pieces as well, of course, but all of the other pieces have the option of moving back and forth between light and dark squares if necessary. Bishops cannot, so they are especially sensitive to pawn placement. Moving your bishop often does less to make it powerful than moving a pawn out of its way and onto a different colored square. If that can't be done, you need to maneuver your bishop outside the pawn structure. In any event, try regarding pawn moves as indirect bishop moves. This principle is important from a defensive standpoint as well. If you move a pawn and the move opens an important diagonal, especially a diagonal leading toward your king or another valuable piece, you immediately strengthen the enemy bishop that travels on that diagonal. Conversely, a pawn move or exchange can have a powerful effect on the enemy if it creates an obstacle or, even better, gridlock on the squares where his bishop wants to move. This is particularly significant if he only has one bishop left. Locking your pawns with his so that his bishop can't get through the center will tend to make his bishop impotent for so long as the pawn structure remains in place. Black to move. What is the best move? The rook fork. Introduction. Double attacks with the rook are simple enough to understand, but they also are easily overlooked because the rook is used so heavily for other more familiar purposes. The suitable targets for a rook fork are the enemy king, the enemy queen, if the rook has protection, or any loose piece. As a practical matter, the targets of a rook fork almost always include either the king, a loose piece, or both. This will be the guiding principle behind our target-based searching. The visual pattern involved also can be stated simply: a rook can slide between two pieces on the same rank or two pieces on the same file. The first pattern is more common. In the skeletal diagram to the left, white's rook has forked black's king and bishop. The other type of fork, the double attack against pieces on the same file, occurs less often and can be a bit harder to see because the rook then moves into the forking position horizontally. The eye is more accustomed to tracing the rook's path up and down the board, rather than from side to side. Another factor sometimes making rook forks harder to see is that the enemy targets may begin with other pieces between them, yours, his, or both, that have to be cleared out of the way before the fork can work. The solution to all these difficulties is to be habitual and thorough in looking for enemy pieces on the same rank or file, just as you are in looking for pieces on the same diagonal, and this regardless of whether there are other pieces between them. The principle is general: when you look at lines on the board and pieces resting on them, Follow all the way through. Don't let your eyes stop when they hit an obstacle, because the obstacle may be removable through an exchange or by other means. If there are two enemy pieces on the same line, you want to see that pattern every time regardless of what lies between them. Occasions for double attacks by a rook arise less often than forks with the other pieces we have considered, and there are only a few special wrinkles that rooks present. This chapter therefore is shorter than the previous ones. White to move. What is the best move? Simple cases. Let's begin with some simple rook forks. Ask traditional questions. What black pieces are loose? The knight and rook. What checks can white give with his rook? Rook moves to d1 and rook moves to b7. We seek a match between these possibilities and find it in rook moves to b7, check. A move that wins the knight after black moves his king. Absorb the position visually. The spectacle of the black king and knight both on the penultimate rank should immediately suggest tactical possibilities. They aren't on squares of the same color, so a double attack by a knight or bishop won't work, but they are easy prey for a rook, or queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Start by asking what black can do with his rook. The first part of the inquiry is whether it has any checks to give. There is one. Rook moves to c2, check. Does the move attack anything else? Yes, it picks up the loose bishop on b2. Anytime you see the enemy king and another piece other than a rook on the same rank, an instinct for a fork should be triggered. Black to move. What is the best move? What checks can black give with his rooks? None. What loose pieces does white have? 2. The bishop and knight. As usual, we're setting pawns to one side, and they are lying on the same rank. The second, perfect for a double attack by the rook. As this position and the previous one both show, rook, or queen, forks on the opponent's second rank are a fairly common pattern because pieces there often are loose, they frequently get no protection from their fellow rooks, which are on the first rank, and they can't be protected by pawns. Naturally this pattern lends itself to double attacks by the queen as well. The rook's moves, like the bishop's moves, are a subset of the moves a queen can make. In any event, rook moves to d2 wins black a piece. White to move. What is the best move? White has no checks with his rook, but you want to be equally alert for attacks you can make against loose pieces. Here the bishop at h5 is black's only loose piece, and the rook can attack it with rook moves to f5. From that square you see the rook also can attack the knight at e5. The knight is protected by the black queen, but it also is already attacked by the white queen. So the knight is a classic case of a piece that is threatened once and protected once and therefore is as good as loose. If black moves the bishop after white plays rook moves to f5, white then plays rook takes knight and black dares not recapture lest he lose his queen to queen takes queen. White wins a piece. Black to move. What is the best move? Scan for checks with black's rooks and you find 2, rook moves to h1, losing the rook to king takes rook, and rook moves to g3. Ask whether rook moves to g3 attacks anything else, and find the white knight at g5, which is loose, so you would have been looking for a way to take it anyway. Does rook moves to g3, check. Lose the rook to pawn from f2 takes rook? No, the pawn is pinned by black's bishop at c5, so its protection of g3 is illusory. Rook moves to g3, check. Thus wins the knight. This is an example of a rook fork requiring a horizontal move. It may be a little harder than the other type to see at first, as noted earlier. White to move. What is the best move? The arrangement of black's king and knight seems almost perfect for a rook fork. A king and a loose piece on the same rank with nothing between them always should set off an alarm, and here white has a rook at the ready on e1. The problem is that the black king guards the forking square, e7, and white has no way to add protection to that square that is safe and holds the initiative. Time to give up? No, time to imagine playing the fork anyway and asking what would be possible if it fails. Thus 1. Rook moves to e7, check. King takes rook, and now black's king has moved, requiring a fresh look at the resulting position. The king's move would have left the bishop on g6 loose, plus the king would be on e7, a dark square, and the rook at h8 would be on a dark square as well. White has a knight in the vicinity, and on a dark square. You get the picture. 2 Knight takes bishop, check. Is a knight fork that takes the bishop right away and wins back the rook next move. White gains a piece with the sequence. This position illustrates a valuable instinct to develop. The mind recoils initially at the thought of rook moves to e7, check. Because it loses the rook, the natural temptation is to abandon the idea and search for something safer. Cultivate the opposite habit of mind, a willingness to persist, imagining the loss of the rook and looking for what would then be possible on the board. White to move. What is the best move? Creating a target. Now we turn to studies that involve creating targets for rook forks, usually by forcing a preliminary exchange. A common complication is that at the outset of the position the rook's path to the forking square is blocked by the piece that starts the exchange. You have to be able to see that the exchange not only creates a good target but also creates an open line for the rook to reach the key square. Begin with the position on the left. A customary way to start thinking about tactical opportunities is to ask what captures white can make and with what consequences. Here he has just one. Knight takes at b7, the recapture is bishop takes knight. Obviously the exchange is unprofitable on its face, but imagine the board afterwards and ask what would then be possible. What loose pieces would black have? Both bishops. What checks would white have? Rook moves to e1 and rook moves to c7, the latter as a result of the line opened by the earlier exchange. These facts can be stitched together into a fork. Rook moves to c7, check. Wins the bishop that would then be on b7. White to move. What is the best move? This time try tracing the white rook's possible moves through any other pieces, searching for interesting destinations. At first the e1 rook may look most promising, but in fact the one on a5 has the more intriguing potential. Follow its path horizontally through the white knight, at e5, to a square where the rook can give a check, g5. Again the question becomes whether the knight can vacate e5 in a way that creates a target on the other side of the check. One knight takes at g4 is the answer. If black replies knight takes knight, then black's knight ends up loose and 2. Rook moves to g5, check. Wins it after the king moves. This is almost identical to the previous position, of course, except that the rook's move is horizontal rather than vertical. White to move. What is the best move? What checks can white's rook give? 2. Rook takes at f7 and rook moves to d8. The interesting question about rook moves to d8 is whether a black piece can be moved elsewhere onto the back rank and thus turn that check into a double attack. White only has one other piece to work with, the bishop, so try attacking something with it. Bishop moves to b5 threatens the black knight and forces it to move. Where can it go? Its only safe square is b8, and once it's there, rook moves to d8 forks and wins it. At several points in our studies we will see this principle used, an attack on an enemy knight that forces it to move somewhere useful to you. The thing to remember about knights is that their range of motion is inherently limited, they never can make it to more than 8 squares, and where, as here, they are near the edge of the board, that number gets even smaller. This often makes it easy to figure out where a knight will have to go if attacked, and thus turns attacks on enemy knights into very useful forcing moves. White to move. What is the best move? What black pieces are loose? Really just the bishop on d1. Notice how black's knight is protected by the black rook against capture by white's rook. How can white attack the bishop? With rook moves to d3. To make that move interesting, another loose piece needs to be lured elsewhere onto the d-file. The black knight is the only real candidate. Ask what the knight protects on the d-file that you might attack. Seemingly nothing, but maybe you can get the knight onto the d6 square by making trouble there with a pawn advance toward promotion, and the two exchanges that naturally follow. 1. Pawn from d5 moves to d6, pawn from c7 takes at d6, 2. Pawn from c5 takes at d6, knight takes at d6, and now 3. Rook moves to d3 forks the bishop and knight. Black might see this and postpone knight takes at d6, first playing rook takes rook. Black is thinking that after white recaptures with pawn from f2 takes rook, black can play knight takes at d6 without fear of being forked. But white doesn't reply to rook takes rook by recapturing. He moves his d-pawn to d7 and now it can't be stopped from promoting. Black is better off putting up with the fork after all. White to move. What is the best move? Moving the king into position. What interesting visual pattern do you see here? Black pieces lined up on the 7th rank. The white rook on e1 is poised to attack at e7, but black's queen prevents this and isn't a feasible target anyway since it can bite. True, it is pinned by white's queen, so it can't bite the rook, but since one rook moves to e7 doesn't give check, black can reply to it with one. Black queen takes queen. Still, the idea suggested by the arrangement of black's pieces is the important thing because it guides your thought experiments. Now you have in mind an attack with the rook and can look for exchanges or other forcing moves that might make it possible, particularly by replacing the queen with a better target. White has a capture, and check, available for the purpose. Queen takes queen, check. To which black replies king takes queen. Now comes white's rook moves to e7, check. Forking and winning the now loose bishop on f7. Black to move. What is the best move? Again, start with the visual pattern. This time from black's point of view, white has two pieces, the two bishops on the same rank. The one on a3 is loose. The arrangement suggests a possible fork by the rook. Of course black's own knight is in the way at d4, and would need to be vacated with a threat that forces white's response, and the other white bishop, the one at f3, is not yet loose. But both problems can be addressed with an exchange. Black plays knight takes bishop, white replies king takes knight. In addition to bringing the king onto the same rank as the loose bishop, the exchange opened the d-file for black's rook. Now a rook moves to d3, check. Wins the piece. A general point, when you have a chance to exchange minor pieces, as black did here, as a matter of course you should play through the exchange in your mind's eye to see how it leaves the board, what lines it opens, what becomes loose, etc. White to move. What is the best move? What black pieces are loose? The knight and rook. Focus on the knight, since it makes a good target for an attack by your own rook. White's rook can attack the knight in one move, either rook moves to c3 or rook moves to d6. If only the black king could be pushed onto the same rank or file as the knight, but how? White's bishop is no help because the king is on the wrong color square. But white has pawns near black's king, and pawns are perfect for pushing pieces around by threatening them. Put more simply, what checks does white have? Answer: push a pawn to f4 or h4. Either way, the only legal move for black's king is onto the 6th rank. When the enemy king is forced to move, you re-evaluate what would be possible. What new checks? Answer: rook moves to d6, check. Winning the knight. So that's the forking idea. But actually white has something even stronger. One rook moves to d6 threatens to mate next move with pawn from h3 moves to h4. Blocking the idea with pawn from h5 moves to h4 doesn't work for black, because then white has pawn from f3 moves to f4, check. Forcing the king to h5, and then bishop moves to d1, checkmate. Instead black has to reply to 1. Rook moves to d6 with rook takes at a4, using his rook to defend the 4th rank. But then white has bishop takes rook and the threat of pawn from f3 moves to f4, checkmate. Black can fend off the immediate mate threat with pawn from f5 moves to f4, but promptly loses his knight to rook takes knight, and now he is out of pieces. The sequence is worth playing through in your mind's eye a few times. White to move. What is the best move? Avoid doing anything without first examining any checks you can give and their consequences. Here white has rook takes at g6, check. Which goes nowhere, but then he also has queen moves to d2, check. Don't overlook backward moves. Black is forced to move his king onto the same rank as his queen. Rook moves to d7, check. Forks them, and a move later black wins a queen for a rook. Notice that attacks by the rook against a queen, like similar attacks by a bishop, only work if the attacking piece has protection. Here white's queen still guards the eventual forking square, d7, when it delivers check from d2. Or you might get there this way: white's rook can attack the black queen, and can do it with protection, by moving to d7. That's easy, but boring, but it might make you wonder whether the black king could be pushed onto that same rank with a check. You find queen moves to d2, check. White to move. What is the best move? Near the beginning of the James Bond movie From Russia with Love, a chess match is depicted between the villainous Kronstein, playing the white pieces, and one McAdams. The position is pictured here. Kronstein plays 1. Knight takes bishop, discovering check. McAdams replies king moves to h7. Meanwhile Kronstein has been summoned away by a secret message from his bosses at Spectre, so now he plays 2. Queen moves to e4, check. And McAdams resigns. Black's best reply move would have been 2. Pawn from g7 moves to g6, blocking the check, but this creates a fork for white with rook moves to f7, winning black's queen for a rook. The position was based on one that arose between Boris Spassky and David Bronstein in Leningrad in 1960, though in the real game there were white pawns on c5 and d4. Bronstein resigned after Spassky played 2. Queen moves to e4, check. As a study in the rook fork, the lesson of the position lies in 3 events that make rook moves to f7, check. Possible: A. Black's king stepped forward from the 8th rank to the 7th, a classic site for rook forks because the rank can't be guarded by pawns and tends not to be patrolled, for defensive purposes, by rooks. B. One of black's pawns stepped forward from the 7th rank to the 6th, opening a line between the king and queen. And C. White's queen moves to e4 cleared a path up the f-file for his rook. Each of these events is a type that can cause new tactics to become available, pins and skewers, as we shall see later, and forks, as we see here. That's all you need to see about the position for present purposes, but for the sake of completeness we can consider a couple of other variations. What, for example, is black's best reply to white's initial 1? Knight takes bishop. It's 1. Knight moves to e6, which blocks the check and pretty well puts out the tactical fire. Suppose, however, that in reply to 1. Knight takes bishop, black plays 1. King moves to h8. Now white can't play queen moves to e4 with check to clear the way for the rook fork. But white still has a wonderful move, queen moves to c4, aligning the queen with the bishop on b3 and threatening to mate next move on g8. Black has no good reply. King moves to h7 doesn't help at all. Queen moves to e6 blocks white's queen but now allows white to play rook takes knight, check. Instead, if black recaptures rook takes rook, his queen is left loose and white takes it. If black doesn't take the rook he soon will be mated. So black's best move after 1. Knight takes bishop, check. King moves to h8, 2. Queen moves to c4 is knight moves to d7, clearing a path for the e8 rook to use to protect the mating square g8. But the knight's move leaves g6 loose, and white uses it to play knight moves to g6, check. A fork that takes black's queen next turn. Finally, suppose that after 1. Knight takes bishop, king moves to h7, 2. Queen moves to e4, check. Black declines to step his g-pawn forward and instead plays 2. Knight moves to g6. This blocks the check without opening up the 7th rank for the rook fork white would like to play. But now black is in bigger trouble, as white has 3. Queen takes knight g6, king moves to h8, forced, 4. Knight moves to f7, check. Always look for the next check in these situations. Now if 4. King moves to g8, then 5. Knight moves to g5, check. Discovering check by the bishop, and white is about to mate. Or if 4. Queen takes knight, then 5. Rook takes queen and white again will mate soon. Black can use his rook to throw some checks at white's king, but this is just desperation. Other replies to white's 2. Queen moves to e4, check. Likewise end with black getting mated. E.g., 2. King moves to h8, 3. Rook takes at f8, check. Rook takes rook, 4. Knight moves to g6, check. King moves to h7, 5. Knight takes rook, check. Plus, king moves to h8, queen moves to h7, checkmate. Some of the ideas in these variations as well as the idea of the discovered check that starts the sequence when white's knight steps away from f7 will be easier to understand after you have worked through the later parts of these lessons.